Hello, hello. Welcome to episode 12 from the North. I'm Hermania and Edu is with me from Canada.
Uh,
What's up, Edu?
all good. It's a little sick. A little
A
sick.
little sick. It's
Yeah.
been a rough couple of days. As we said last week, today we'll be talking about fake elections in Venezuela.
Yay.
There's a lot to unpack, but basically Edu and I are in a laughing out of sadness and despair mood because this is the cycle that we have seen over and over again since both of us and our generation has a conscious mind.
Yeah, we can afford to be sad about these things. Like at this point, we just laugh ironically and trying to move on. But yeah, it's just the never-ending cycle of the government doing their own thing and the opposition just falling for every single trap possible. Uh,
It's always, I think the cycle is, stalemate, protest, negotiations end up in elections.
Nothing
The elections
happens.
don't do anything, nothing happens. Then they
Back
try to make protests happen again. But I don't know that the people are going to follow them much longer since nearly 60% of Venezuelans decided not to vote. And we'll talk in depth about that a little bit later. But let's start unpacking the fake elections. If you guys watch this show, you should by now be pretty in tune with how 21st century dictators stay in power by going through unfree and unjust elections. We just saw it in Nicaragua in one of the most extreme cases. So, of course, the first thing that these regimes use is first world idiots to come into the country and say, look how amazing and free these elections are, and in this socialist utopia. Thank you, Chavez. So, of course, here we're going to see DSA Portland, the whitest people you could find in America, are once again visiting a dictatorship to then come back to the US and say, I was there. I was an election. What is it they call themselves?
witness
Election. A
or a
witness. What?
protector. I don't know, whatever
They
revolutionary word.
monitor. They monitor elections.
Yeah, this is honestly, this stuff is insane. The DSA just keeps getting worse and worse, and of course, we're not gonna hear anything from the usual suspects, members of the DSA, other than silence. Um, at best, at worst, we may be hearing from them congratulating Maduro as well, some other politicians around the world have done, including Vladimir Putin, Evo Morales, etc., etc.,
The
etc.
authoritarian bloc. If you thought the Cold War was over, like,
Oh boy,
sorry.
oh boy, do I have
But
news for you?
they committed a little mistake, because the Cuban puppet dictator, Diaz-Canel, sent his congratulations for an overwhelming victory for Maduro and the Chavista regime, and now we're before the official results were out.
Not that it matters, not that we're surprised. Again, like it's something that we discussed last week when we were talking about the article from the Atlantic, which again is I don't want to make the whole thing about this article, but in reality, it's pretty good. It's great.
That is what this show is about as well. I mean,
It's what the show is about, and referring to that article, and again, please read it if you haven't read it yet. It's the Maduro model of dictatorship, which is not about keeping the forms, which is not about proving to the international community one way or another that you're doing good, that you're democratic. They don't care about that. They couldn't give a flying shit about it. And even then, you still have the DSA guys going to Venezuela to make a propaganda move. Even then, you still have some members of the opposition that decided to be a part of this circus. I don't know. It's just Maduro and the Chavismo in general. They have. But we've been saying this is a cycle. This is not the first time that they've done it. They've been doing this over and over and over and over ever since before Maduro, like with Chavez. Back when we still
right.
had some kind of actual democratic institutions left. Uh, and now that we don't have any, now that the country is like, you can consider Venezuela a failed state, um, we're still going back to this. Like, the opposition
Right.
just keeps going back to this. And I don't know, man. I don't know how long we
And
can keep this going.
I mean, so far 23 years and counting. But as you were saying, this is something we have seen for 23 years. And I always want to point out to those who are living under democracy privilege that may not understand how we could oppose an election. It's not even about the vote rig. They were trying to make the election seem like this was the reconciliation between the regime and the opposition. The regime still sent out their violent armed government supporter groups known as the colectivos to intimidate voters violently at voting centers. Human Rights Watch received notice from people who were at the voting centers, from people who were working the voting centers, that armed government groups were intimidating voters. Not only that, but, and this is some scary shit. The correspondent from the New York Times, Julie Turkowitz, was in Venezuela covering the elections, and she reported that a young guy at a voting center, had told her that he was there because his mother received a text from the PSV, the government party, saying, "Your children haven't voted yet." He said as soon as his mom got that text, he ran out of the house to the voting center. So these are the conditions for this election. And now, so that should tell you enough about why people like Edu and I, are nearly 60% of Venezuelans, decided not to participate in this. But let's now talk about why and why we came to this conclusion, because just like in other dictatorships posing as democracies, such as Turkey, Iran, Russia, the opposition has this same debate. You know, they feel like they don't have a lot of tools. The regimes have the monopoly of violence. If you go out to protest, they try to kill you, they jail you, they exile you. So out of despair comes this question: if we don't vote, what else do we do? And that's the arguments we've been getting. You know, I said, even though those who are outside the country don't even get an option, I said, I don't believe in these elections, I'm not going to vote. My main argument that this brings us back in our fight for democracy, because we've been for 2 decades trying to show the world that there's a dictatorship in Venezuela. We finally achieved that by not engaging in the fake election of 2018, giving the international community the power to say these elections weren't real, this is not a democracy, this is a dictatorship. Finally, we got that after years of the country already being a dictatorship. Well, now we're engaging in elections. So those who are outside the country, international viewers that don't know all the details you and I know, are going to say, well, I guess things are better now, because before the opposition was telling us that they couldn't go into elections with this murderous regime because the elections were fake, but now they're going to elections. So I guess things are better. That's how the international viewer is going to see this. And I think yesterday it became harder to argue that Venezuela is a dictatorship abroad. So, Edu, I'm gonna ask you all the things that those who decided to vote have told us.
Okay, go for it.
What is the point of not voting? If you don't vote, you gotta do something.
Well, the point of not voting is precisely what you said. If we understand that Venezuela is not a democracy, right? And we understand that there's so much more to democracy than going to the polls, right? Because, you know, if that was the definition of democracy, North Korea would be a democracy, Cuba would be a democracy, you know what I mean? It's not just going to elections. It's the fact that not everyone can run for an election. It's the fact that you don't have fair chances at an election, for example, to compete against someone who's a member of the government, who's running for a position that has the unlimited resources of the state to do it, which is illegal. But in Venezuela, that stuff doesn't matter. You cannot say that we have democracy in Venezuela if all major TV channels, every news, well, not every, but most news outlets, or at least the ones that people have access to in Venezuela, are directly or indirectly in the hands of the state. There are many conditions that are required for you to say this is a democratic country. And in Venezuela, we don't have those conditions. By accepting this circus, because at the end of the day, that's what it is, a circus, we are validating the position of the government. We went from not recognizing the government to effectively recognizing the government. Because, newsflash, that's what you're doing if you decide to compete with them. You know what I mean? If you decide to go to polls against a Chavista major candidate, if you decide that you can run an election and compete fairly against it, then you're validating that this is a democratic regime, which is not. We all know that. So yeah, not voting is a matter of democracy. If I don't believe that we have the conditions to vote, I'm not going to vote. And you say, well, what's the worst that can happen if you vote? Well, the worst that can happen is that, as Hermania said, you just made the entire situation more complicated for every Venezuelan. Because how on earth are we going to go out in the world and tell other governments, other institutions that care about Venezuela that we don't have a democracy, when our opposition, not mine, but our opposition, they're trying to represent Venezuelans, or so they claim, is willingly going to elections.
We should probably point out that even though the opposition, embarrassingly, without dignity, decided to go to these elections, how many posts did they give them, Elu? How many did they win? To government?
Well, I want to talk about a specific guy, a guy that we've been making fun ever since our first episode, I believe, who's Tomas Guanipa. Remember, if you guys don't remember what we talked about in the other episodes, I'm going to give you a quick brief. This is the guy that was leading the negotiations in Mexico. The negotiations that we had when we had somewhat of a stalemate, when we didn't recognize the government, still playing with the sanctions, still playing with the little power that the interim government of Juan Guaido had to make something happen. This guy abandoned the negotiation tables. Mind you, this guy was exiled. He was barred from coming to Venezuela. If he set foot in Venezuela, he was going to go to jail.
Allegedly.
He traded that position in the negotiation table as a leading member of the negotiation table to be able to go back to Venezuela and participate in the elections that the government was given to him. This is a guy, if you are not from Venezuela, this is a guy that comes from the western region of Venezuela, Estado Zulia. Very regionalistic region of the country. That's where my family is from. I love it with all my heart. Nothing to do with the capital, nothing to do with Caracas in many regards. And then this guy decided to run for mayor in downtown Caracas, the Libertador.
Like, get farther from Caracas. I always put the example, Zulia's like Texas. Like, imagine a Texan showing up in DC to run for office.
In New York. To run for office. I would say it's even more crazy. Like, well, regardless, instead of... the thing is that he went and ran for mayor. Not only he didn't win, he lost the second spot to another opposition, not part of the mainstream opposition, but just another opposition party. He went third on that election. So he traded being in a negotiation table, actually having some leverage against the government, to go back to Venezuela, do a campaign, and lose like a fucking clown.
He didn't just trade his position. He sold all of us out for that.
All of us for what? To lose in an election? What? And this is the main thing. Now that we have the results, we can discuss as to, okay, you voted. What have you accomplished? Let's go back to the number of the people who didn't vote. We're talking about 60% of Venezuelans who didn't vote. To be
And that
fair,
is a political statement too. Going back to like doing nothing, no, that's a political
that
statement.
is a political statement, and that's the only good takeaway that I'm getting from this whole elections is that Twitter is not the real world. You may see the politicians talking, inviting people to go and vote, etc., but at the end of the day, a la hora de la chiquita, people didn't vote. And to be fair, to put that number in context, 25% of Venezuelans are living in exile right now. That includes me, that includes Germania. So a lot of people
Does that number go into that calculation? Like when they say 60% of Venezuelans didn't vote, does that include those abroad?
it does, but there's caveats to it, and very important caveats to it. A, even if we take the mass migration into consideration, that makes up roughly 25% of Venezuelans that are currently in exile. 65 minus 25 is 35% of abstention. Third, that's just like the best case scenario, but in reality, a lot of the people that are out of the country are not even registered for the CNE, the National Electoral Council. They're not
No, I don't
registered to
think there
vote.
was a system. Was there a system for Venezuelans abroad?
There's a system, but
I don't think it was open or anything. I didn't hear of any voting abroad happening.
it's not. And like considering that we haven't gone or consider gone to elections or considered elections to be real ever since at least 2016 after the National Assembly elections, which by the way, if you remember what happened in 2015, the last free elections that we had that the opposition won, and the
Which they
consequence
were free. We don't have to say they were free just because we won. They were still not free.
they were not free, but they were freer than the election that we're having right now. And we should remember what happened afterwards. We should remember the aftermath. When the government loses an election, they don't really lose an election. They just govern above you. Remember what happened? I might be mixing my years, but this either happened in 2016 or 2017. But I remember that after massive protests that we had in 2017, over 100 dead people in the street, all of them killed, murdered by the regime. Some members of the opposition decided to go to regional elections, right? Two of them won. I believe it was Zulia with Juanipa. I think it was the other Juanipa. And Táchira or Mérida, if I'm not mistaken. Just another state. And guess what happened? The government decided to keep governing the regions without them. They put this is very common in Venezuela.
They called him a protector of the area, something like that.
A protectorate. So this is something that the government does when they don't win an election in one region. They just say, oh, you know what? We cannot allow the fascists in Venezuela. There's no fascists in Venezuela. Newsflash, to run this area, so we're just gonna overrun not the results of the election, but who is really in power in
You
this
still
region.
get to be governor. We're just gonna put another guy here, and we're gonna call him protector, and we're gonna give him all the power and resources. But go ahead and call yourself the governor.
Exactly. So, like, I feel that that's pretty much being the understanding of most people is that, well, elections are not going to get us anywhere, because even if we do win, which is extremely hard given the circumstances which we have described before, censorship, banning people from running to elections, forcing people to vote for one candidate or the other, etc., etc. But even if you do win, that doesn't mean anything because the government takes over. So it seems that we've reached that understanding, at least in the last 2-3 years, and then we decided to move on with the interim government that went in its own direction, didn't have the results that we all expected, but it was a step in the right direction, or at least way more than keep going back to this cycle of elections.
What about Edu? This is an argument that the intellectuals have, that dictatorships can in fact be ended through elections. They always bring up the Pinochet example.
They can, and there are many examples of that happening. Pinochet is one, definitely. So is the apartheid in South Africa. But you have, like, the context is very different from what we're seeing now in countries such as Venezuela Nicaragua, etc., etc. For example, going to the apartheid. I don't know, maybe butchering that, in South Africa. The reason why apartheid ended and why Nelson Mandela eventually became president of South Africa and black people gained all equal rights, in paper at least, to white people in South Africa, was because of the immense effort of the international community sanctioning, and closing in the South African economy to force them to do something different. I am not very well familiar with the Pinochet case, what happened in Chile, but I do believe that at that point in time, the institutions were kind of just a little bit more strong than Pinochet. And like at the end of the day, they're completely different contexts. But Venezuela, it's not at all closer to what was going on in Chile or what was going on in South Africa and other cases where democratic elections have been the door to get out of a dictatorship. Venezuela, it's more in a Venezuela is a narco state. It's a terrorist state. It's a failed state. Maduro is not a president. He's more like a warlord. And I mean this in reality. In Venezuela, even though we always say, the state, the power of the state and all that, the state in reality, they have diminished their power so much to the point where we've seen what's been going on over the last years. They can win a war against guerrilla members from Colombia.
They have lost the monopoly of violence because they themselves have armed other thugs to protect them.
Exactly. So in Venezuela, because there's absolutely no institutions, because it's a failed state, we cannot go with this crumbling, not even crumbling institutions, fake institutions, because that's what they are, and have elections with them. If we wanted to have a democratic way out of this, we will have to have real strong independent institutions. And that was the point of the negotiations. That has been the entire point up until they decided to run two elections of the opposition over the last 4 years. We need real conditions in order to go to a real election.
You know what's weird to me? I read an analysis about this, and I hadn't considered this. For some reason, a lot of the opposition leaders, to convince people to go out to vote, they were sort of treating it like voting was a muscle that you needed to exercise. Yes, this elections may not be free or fair, but we have to fill all the spaces that we can. We have to prepare for an eventual free presidential election.
No.
And it's no, you don't gotta practice voting, honey. We know how to do it. It's not a muscle that you exercise. We don't,
Even if we don't know how to do it, even if we have forgotten about how to do it, even if you are an adult, a Venezuelan adult over the age of 18 who has never seen democracy in their life, that doesn't matter. Let me remind you, the first democratic elections that we had in Venezuela in the 40s, where we elected Romulo Gallegos, the number of participants in that election was a record high, and I believe we haven't seen anything like that ever since in the history of Venezuela. I believe it's something like plus 75%, plus 80, 90%, something like that. Everyone went and voted. Because before that, we didn't have the right to vote. And once we gained it, every Venezuelan or most Venezuelans wanted to participate on it. Venezuelans are not stupid. This is not something that, we need to practice democracy. No. What you want people to do is to vote because you want to be part of the machine, because you have given up in the path that you had of actually having good conditions before having elections.
We've already talked about this guy. It's the same situation as who we just discussed. Manuel Rosales, someone who was allegedly fleeing from the regime, an alleged freedom fighter who was once a presidential candidate that said he was in exile. He just returned, and they gave him, now he's governor of Zulia, the same guy that was governor of Zulia when I lived in Venezuela. And then the other one that won a governorship in Nueva Esparta, the state where the beautiful island of Margarita is the same guy that was governor of Nueva Esparta before Chavez even got here.
They say that, and this is like, I think this is the biggest issue in the Venezuelan opposition, is that the leadership in the Venezuelan opposition, it's plus 60 years old. Yes, we do see a lot
It's
of.
also authoritarian. There's no way of like renewing that.
There's no renewing of that leadership. The youngers that we're gonna get are Leopoldo Lopez, Enrique Capriles, and they're not young.
They've been there since the beginning of Chavez.
They've been there like for 20 years already, trying to achieve something, and they haven't done it. There is not change in the leadership of these parties. We're not seeing new faces. We're not seeing young faces leading this party.
At the beginning, when they were deciding on the candidate, there were young candidates that were new leadership. What did they do?
They
replaced a young leader with Tomas Guanipa, who's not even from the state.
And then he lost. He got a third place in Libertador, despite of the warnings of the opposition telling us who dare to, confront them and say this is a terrible, horrible decision. Even if you do want to participate in elections, Tomás Guanipa should not be the candidate to run in Caracas. But there's no democracy. There is no sense.
And you know what's interesting? Even the young leaders who ran, none of them won. Who are the only ones who won? The ones who we know have talks and a relationship with the regime. The old ones, Manuel Rosales, el de Nueva Esparta. It was none of the new leaders who have a chance at becoming someone. The regime doesn't give them a chance, no.
No, it's the old ones that they can control. These people that are winning these elections, I'm talking of the 3 or 4 opposition governors that won. Apparently, one of them is still. We'll see about it if it gets to 4 or 5. But for the most part, these guys are people that were into politics before Chavez. We're talking 20 years ago. Some of them have been in the system, and by the system I mean in political positions, since the 80s. And those are the faces of the Venezuelan opposition today. Those are the same people that have been in this never-ending cycle of disappointment and stupidity with the Venezuelan regime, with the Chavista regime, ever since 1998.
And these guys don't like exile, because they're used to having their own little kingdom. Manuel Rosales loves kingdom in the state of Zulia. Exile is hard. They go try it for a few years, and then they're like, you know what? I don't need democracy in Venezuela. Just give me my little post, and then I can be king of my own little region, and that's okay with me.
And that's the thing, and that's the main point that I feel that a lot of people have not understood yet, and we have to make it clear. The reason why there are people in the Venezuelan opposition that have just gave up on the path of having free and fair elections, and they just decided to run in this made-up elections by the regime, they are doing it out of survival because they want to live out of the system, because they understand that doing the actual fight, it's way harder, because they're frustrated because we haven't had results fighting that good fight, which is completely understandable. And they decided, you know what? I'm not going to live my life on exile. I'm not going to live my life fighting for a lost cause in their minds. They just go back to the country, they plug themselves into the machine, and they start living their lives as essentially part of the regime. And I want to make this point. This is my opinion, but I want to make this point very clear. There is no difference, absolutely no difference, between a member of the PSUV party, the Socialist Party of Venezuela, and a member of the fake opposition that decided to run for elections at this point. If you are part of the system, if you are part of the machine, then you are the problem. If you don't understand that this machine doesn't work and that it needs to be completely rebranded and remade from the ground up because we simply don't have democratic conditions in order to do it, then you just gave up. You became part of the system, and you, my friend, you are the enemy of Venezuelans.
That's a hot take, and we as Venezuelans get a lot of heat from other Venezuelans for having this position. But the message from yesterday, I was quite worried. Once I started seeing the DSA tankies in Venezuela saying, look at this Democratic Party and all of that, I realized how grave the opposition's participating in this election is going to be in the terms of what I already said, the narrative of what's going on in Venezuela. I read a tweet that I thought was genius that said something like, yes, the narrative may not be much. The narrative that we had established that Venezuela is a dictatorship and we don't participate in elections, but the narrative was all we had.
Now
It
we
was
don't have
all
that.
we had.
Now we don't have that.
But still, after I was licking my wounds and crying over the fact that now first world tankies are, it's coming.
I
What are you
know.
talking about, Gusana? There were elections in November. What dictatorship? So
And even just extended, like, even if we can say, yeah, well, their opinion doesn't matter or whatever, this is not something that just stays with the radicals far leftists. This
no.
is something that governments actually have to act upon. And many governments are going to see themselves in a weird position right now. How are we going to keep not recognizing the Venezuelan government if even the Venezuelan opposition decides to run in elections? The Venezuelan opposition has abandoned the narrative that Venezuela is a dictatorship. They have embraced the fact that, this is maybe a dictatorship, but I'm going to go to the polls anyway. Then we don't have anyone to speak in our behalf. Then there's no one speaking on behalf of the Venezuelans, those of us who know that we're living in a dictatorship, which it's pretty much everyone, including those who decided to participate in the elections for one reason or another. Because you may say, yeah, well, I still believe that Venezuela is a dictatorship, but I wanted to vote because I would rather have a opposition mayor than having a Chavista mayor.
A lot of people said that, yeah.
Which is a fair point, but what you're failing to understand, in my opinion, is that in Venezuela, it doesn't matter. There's no independence of local powers, regional powers to the central state. Again, if you win a state, if you win a majorship, a township, whatever, and you dare to do something that the regime doesn't want you to do while you're in office, they're just gonna simply go over you, put someone in place, give them a nice title, and give them all the power and strip all the power that you had or that you earned through elections. So there is no point to elections, and I'm sad to see so many people that, because there's simply nothing else to do, just decided to be part of this. Or some people, maybe they just bought the narrative of the opposition, and that's horrible. That's terrible. That sets us back so many years in our struggle. We're back. I feel we're going to go back to 2014, 2013 levels.
Well, they're already talking about presidential and saying that the perfect candidate, of course, is Manuel Rosales because he had an overwhelming victory in Zulia State. So just how the regime would love a 2024 presidential election with Manuel Rosales as the opposition candidate. But Edu, I do want to give props to Venezuelans because the thug opposition leadership wanted to put us Venezuelans against each other and blaming those of us who don't believe in voting and dictatorship for everything bad that has happened. Well, they were not able to intimidate Venezuelans into supporting their scam project. Because as we said, nearly 60% of Venezuelans sent a message. And the message was, we believe we are under a dictatorship. We don't believe in the regime, and we don't believe in this opposition that continues to fail us. What would happen in a normal country if a party loses overwhelmingly in such an embarrassing way and 60% of people decide not to even make the effort of voting? You ideally, as it should be, you would see opposition leaders taking a mea culpa, saying things have to change, saying we heard the message, we heard the rejection. Someone should have to resign. Another tweet that I read, for once in my lifetime, I would like to see someone in Venezuelan politics in the opposition saying, hey, I get it. I get it.
We screwed up.
We screwed up. I failed. And you know what? I'm done. I get it. I've been trying this for 20 years. People reject me. I'm out. I retire. Thank you. Bye. I'm retiring. We haven't seen that with that ever happened.
That doesn't happen in Venezuela.
So
And
they
again,
want to blame those of us who didn't vote. But I'm so proud
and we
of the nearly 60% of Venezuelans who said no more. Not doing this sham with you. We're not going to help you get your little post in your mayorship so you can have a little power. And we said no more. And that should be a message that we tell the world.
And how do we call that hit? How do we call when a politician or a political leader in general refuses to look at the facts, refuses to take the blame, and always points the finger at a very specific, at a targeted group? We call that populism. So if we're gonna have a populist opposition that is playing with the regime, that are playing to their tune, they're doing exactly what the regime likes, which is provide a fake sense of normality, a fake sense of democracy in a country that has, I guess, forgotten about what democracy is, what democracy should be like. We're not gonna get anywhere.
So we have to scream. It's so frustrating. But yeah, I just want to make the point again. Those of us who didn't vote, we weren't doing nothing. We weren't doing nothing. We were saying we don't want the regime and we don't want this thug opposition either. We want new leadership. We don't want Leopoldo Lopez. We don't want Manuel Rosales. We don't want Tomas Guanipa. We want new leadership. And that's what we said loudly. That was the message that we sent.
And here's what I believe. Again, this is just my personal opinion. But what should be the role of this new leadership, right? Which I guess we can all agree it has to be new, has to be young, at least under the age of 50. But what should be the role of this new leadership? To understand that the fight is not alongside the regime, but against them. In all honesty, a real opposition in Venezuela, an opposition that could threaten the regime in Venezuela, would be absolutely persecuted, tortured, killed, exiled, and murdered by the regime. But if you are willing to be the true opposition, if you are willing to actually do what is necessary to at least be a stone, a rock in the shoe of the regime, it's definitely not through the way that the opposition is doing it. It's through direct action. It's through protest. It's through not engaging in this fake and phony elections.
It's important that you're saying that, because the other thing that they tell us is jest. They were telling me no one is going to come invade Venezuela and the international community is not going to save us. No one was suggesting that. There are other ways they were saying the answer has to come from within. Agreed. But elections are not the only way forward. There is follow what nearly 60% of Venezuelans did.
That's voting.
Called civil disobedience. That's a way of fighting back.
And yes, that's what we need. We need civil disobedience. We need civil resistance. We cannot participate in the system. We need to participate outside of it and attack the system directly through protest, through civil disobedience. It's not something that necessarily has to be like a civil war, completely violent, but as we said, just by refusing to go into elections and send a unified message that we're not participating in this phony fake elections, that's already something huge. Look at what we have achieved in the international community by not participating in the elections of 2017 for the National Constituent Assembly, which were completely phony. Look at what we achieved by not voting in the presidential elections of 2018. We may look back at it and say, what was it for? It was for nothing. Like, we were all excited with Guaido and we didn't achieve anything. But guys, in the context of international geopolitics, the fact that Juan Guaido was recognized by so many countries as the interim president of Venezuela because we didn't want to participate on these elections, that shit's huge. You don't see that in Belarus. You don't see that in Hong Kong. You don't see that in any other countries that are going through similar situations. There's only one country that technically has two presidents, or well, used to at least. which was Venezuela. We can achieve great things if we refuse to participate in the machine of the
And
regime.
civilians achieve that recognition with, internationally. When does Venezuelan make? Not when Manuel Rosales and Leopoldo Lopez say something. It's when Venezuelans go out to protest. It's
Exactly.
when they refuse to participate in an election.
Exactly.
Here, the ones who have achieved the most are not the opposition leaders. It's the Venezuelan
It's
citizen who,
the
again, I'm
people.
so proud of.
It's the people, and that's exactly what it is. And this is the problem, another big problem of the Venezuelan opposition, but this is not something new. This is something that they've been doing over and over and over ever since 2013, which is when we had the people out there. And people are not out there because of the opposition, but despite of the opposition may be the one calling to march. The opposition may be the one saying, let's meet here and let's meet there, but people are not going to support the opposition. People go because they are against the regime. Once we achieve the level of civil disobedience that we had in 2014, the level of civil disobedience that we have in 2017, when the government is really sweating, it's really starting to lose power over the people, what happens? They are forced to try to go for elections. And what's the mistake? For negotiations. And what is the mistake of the Venezuelan opposition? Taking that offer at face value, and at the end of it,
They literally tell people to go home. This is what has happened.
this is what has happened.
The regime will use the opposition leaders to literally tell people, no more, go home.
And that's horrible. That means that the opposition is working against us. And the problem is that because there's no other leadership capable of moving people, of getting people out into the streets again and fight the regime, except the opposition that can do it whenever they want, we're always going to be in this never-ending cycle of violence, repression, and suppression. So what we need, it's a new opposition. Doesn't have to be a leader, doesn't have to be a single person. It needs to be a movement of people that are not only rejecting the regime, but are also rejecting the fake opposition. That we're out there at our own volition, not because of what people in Acción Democrática or Voluntad Popular and any other party have to say. That if the government wants to negotiate with someone, it needs to negotiate with the people and not with the fake opposition. And what do we want? We want freedom, and we want justice. And if you're not willing to give us freedom and justice, we're gonna have to be out there. Until then, though, I guess they're still winning.
Oh, fuck. I just want to make this point. It's a matter of semantics, but it actually plays a lot into this. This political analyst that I really admire always says that in dictatorships, there's no opposition, because opposition, the definition says that there is a real opportunity to gain power through democratic means. So in dictatorships, there is only dissidents. And maybe we should start, because this is what's happening. The opposition in Venezuela behaves like the opposition in a democratic country, but that's not the context. They should be dissidents. What do dissidents do? They dissent.
That's exactly what we do. And we have, and by we, I mean most Venezuelans, leaving behind the Venezuelan opposition, we have been living in insurrection for too long. We have been living through the government and around the government, especially the people that are still living in Venezuela, to keep going on with their lives, finding ways to keep going forward. We created a black market. We made the black market so big that at one point it essentially became the only market in Venezuela. Let me remind
the economy. The citizens single-handedly helped the economy by deciding to dollarize.
Absolutely. So we have been insurrecting for too long. Now we need to move it forward, and we need to actually have a revolution. And this is funny enough, because we always say that we're anti-revolution, but we're not anti-revolution. We're anti-revolution in systems that are democratic, in systems that have democratic institutions that can allow people to discuss, to sit down, and then go into the polls to make their will heard, to have their representatives be the ones that are making the policies, that are changing the laws, and that are making their countries better or worse. When there's no democracy, when there's no institution, and when there is no willing of external factors to come into countries such as Venezuela to make something happen, that is when it's time for revolution. And until we don't get a very strong feeling of what we need to have, it's a revolution. Until we get a good leadership that can actually get us through this, that can reject the old system, that can reject Chavismo, Madurismo, la oposición, and every single one of those pigs that decides to be part of this system that is constantly killing, that is constantly raping, that is constantly going above every single right of every single Venezuelan, we're not gonna get anywhere. But once we get there, once we do have these people, once we do have this drive, we are probably gonna be able to achieve something. So that's my message. Let's revolt.
So, Edu, why don't you run for office? That was great.
Because I'm too tired.
So, obviously, this episode was about the fake elections in Venezuela, but to close it off, I do want us, Edu, to mention the case of Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai. She spoke up about the harassment that she faced under the Chinese communist system's sports system, I guess. And she hasn't been seen or heard from in months after doing that.
She came out yesterday with one statement saying that she was fine, but in those of us who have lived through these regimes know that if anything, that's just a red flag. If you have the entire world concerned about your whereabouts, concerned about where you are, how you are, if you are alive to begin with, and then you come out of nowhere saying that you're fine, and then you go back into the obscurity, you're probably being coerced into saying what you're trying to say. What has been amazing, though, has been the response of the international community to this. This has been great. We can compare this to, for example, the NBA with the Hong Kong fiasco and fucking clowns like LeBron James.
We don't like LeBron in this show.
We don't like LeBron in this show, who decided to tell the people that were raising their voices against the Chinese repression of Hong Kong protests, that decided to tell them shut up and dribble. In the world of tennis, we had the biggest tennis stars being the first ones out.
To Serena. Serena spoke up.
Serena, I believe Federer also did it. Like, all the main tennis figures, the Women Tennis Association, everyone else, everyone involved in the sport decided to speak out against the regime. And that's important, because that's probably how you're going to save the life of this female Chinese player.
It goes back, and I wanted to bring up in this show where there is a campaign going on right now to not participate in the Olympic Games in Beijing, especially as they are disappearing their own athletes. The free nations are perfectly capable of organizing our own games for those who are not about killing, murdering, and disappearing people who speak against the regime. But it's the same thing we were just talking about. Dissidents against opposition. You cannot play the game with these systems. Why are we going to Olympic Games to pretend we are the same and to play the Chinese Communist Party's game, like in their system, in their home region? We're going to just allow our image as free countries to wash their image as killer regimes? No. We should be dissidents and dissent. There you go.
There you go. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's it. We live in a different world than where we were 100 years ago, where this kind of big sports events help bring the world together. Let me remind you, one of the most historical Olympics were the ones in 1936 in Munich. Where Jesse Owens made Hitler cry, which is amazing. We live in an entire different world. We live in a world where sports and events like this are being used as means of propaganda, as means of normalizing relations between democratic nations and countries that are not so democratic, not to say totalitarian at all. This extends not only to the Olympic Games. Extends to the whole role of the United Nations, for example, the World Health Organization, for example. And we are seeing the results of what happens when we just decide to ignore the fact that governments like China, governments like Russia, are using this international non-governmental institutions to further their own projects and their own agendas. So yes, I believe every democratic country in the world should boycott the Olympics in China, especially now that we are very concerned with the life of such a great tennis player.
Well, that was a packed show. We had a lot to say as usual. Thank you so much for joining us on episode 12. And Trulis didn't vote either. I just wanted to point that out.
Macri didn't. Yeah, so see you guys around. We have not, and we will not discuss about the Chile elections yet. It's a complicated topic, but hopefully we'll get back to you with that eventually.
Yes.
Eventually. So take it easy, guys. See you around.